Welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. One of the most important aspects of any project, whether it's research or evaluation, is the choice of analytical approach. The analytical strategy we use shapes how we interpret data and uncover meaningful insights. This is just as true for realist evaluation and realist synthesis as it is for other methods. But with so many tools and analytical processes available, how do we select the most appropriate one for a realist project? And how can we assure that our analytical strategy receives the attention and thorough it truly deserves? These are questions that Steffen Bohni has been reflecting on for some time. He joins us now to share his thoughts on analytical strategies in realist evaluation and realist synthesis, of which has published recently in Manzano and Williams' new book. Steffen, good to see you. How are you?
Thank you. Fine. And thank you so much for inviting me to this podcast.
No worries at all. I'm so excited to talk to you about this because I know how useful the chapter you wrote with Sebastian was for me and for my work. So I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts as well in this kind of context within a podcast conversation. Just for
Thank you.
those Stefan who may have not been exposed to that chapter or to your work so far, would you be happy to share some of your background, your interest, and your exposure so far in realist evaluation and synthesis?
Sure. Well, I've been working with evaluation in various capacities for the past 25 years. Originally, I'm a PhD in social anthropology before I moved into the evaluation space. So I've worked as a practitioner, as a commissioner, and then a user of evaluation, all sorts of evaluations throughout those years. Now I am the Director General of the National Research Center for the Working Environment, that is occupational safety and health, in most countries, in Denmark. So I don't get to do a lot of actual evaluation work anymore, but I sort of try to stay current on developments by looking a lot into the research on evaluation. And one of my particular fields of interest is theory-based evaluation at large, and more specifically, realist evaluation. So with my collaborator, Sebastian Lemire, we did a number of different reviews based on the published realist evaluation literature from 1997 till 2017, so about 20 years covered. And we've been looking at context, how that's been conceptualized and operationalized in realist evaluations. The same with mechanism. We've done sort of a more narrow study on realist trials. And then finally, we did this one here on analytical strategies in realist evaluation, which is really how do you bring together how you study context, mechanism, outcome, configurations, which is really the key, if you want, in working in a realist evaluation setting.
Fantastic, Stephen. Thank you so much. And I love that how first of all the outputs from that work that you've done with Sebastian and the rest of the team, because it's been so interesting reading, but also around this area of data analysis and analytical strategies, which of course are important not only in research but in evaluation, in the work that you do, and for any individual who is trying to make sense of the data that they may have. Because in that chapter that on Manzano and Williams' book that you wrote with Sebastian, it opens by referencing Paulson's idea that there's nothing as practical as a good theory, which of course you reword very nicely, saying there's nothing as practical as a good analytical strategy, which I find a great use of, and a great starting point to the chapter. I guess with that as a starting point, how do you see the role of the analytical strategy in realist evaluation and synthesis, and why does it matter that we are thorough and understand really the different analytical strategies are available to us?
Well, I think that it's really crucial to think about your analytical strategy from the outset in whichever kind of research you do, but particularly so in realist evaluation, because in most humanities and social sciences, there's actually quite a bit of choices in how you shape data and how you shape your data collection. I mean, if you do an interview, the product you get, the text that you get eventually from those those are based on the kind of questions you ask. If you do a survey, with a questionnaire, similarly, it's the questions you ask and the questions you don't ask. So you actually shape data quite a bit. And if you do not think about how is it that I want to use this kind of data, what kind of analysis is it that I want to do, basically you might wind up with a lot of data that are useless for the purposes that you want. So in that point, with that in mind, you have to start thinking very early on about what is my analytical strategy? What kind of data do I want to create or produce? How do I want to bring them together and triangulate different kinds of data, different kinds of analytical techniques to actually answer these evaluation questions that are that are sort of at the front or center of my evaluative endeavor.
That's so interesting, Stefan. That point that you made there around the choices that shape our data and the final outcome that we do. I know that for some people that may seem obvious, but particularly when you're under pressure and you have
Mhm.
deadlines and you have funders telling you to do this at a certain time, it can be easy to not spend the time that is needed and really think around your analytical strategy and just decide, for example, okay, for this piece of work,
Mhm.
I'm going to use a thematic analysis, or I'm going to use a QCA, or I'm going to use a statistical test of some sort. This is talking about research more generally, but
Mhm.
actually having that previous process and choices, first of all, for transparency and replicability to see where those decisions have come up, but also
Mhm.
importantly, as you say, into then the second element, not only the
Mhm.
method that's used, but the
Mhm.
output of it. I think that
Mhm.
that's a really good really good reflections that you're sharing there, particularly in realist evaluation and synthesis and theory-driven methods, where I mean, from your chapter, there was so many analytical strategies that were available. I mean, it was fantastic to see, and I'd be intrigued to see which one of these did you find the most promising for actually testing and refining CMOs? Because there were so many in that chapter, thematic analysis, framework analysis, QCA. Which one did you find the most useful and why?
I wish I could sort of answer that question very clearly and succinctly, but I think that uh, here the true answer is it depends on the data situation. I mean, most evaluation work is done on a contracted basis. So you might not decide the timing of when to initiate the evaluation. You might not be able to decide the budget, the timeline. So there are all these constraints. And this is really, in my mind, what makes evaluation so fascinating. Because I mean, I'm in a research institute where you can actually design the research pretty much on your own accord from the very beginning till the end and the dissemination process and so on. Rarely that is the case in evaluation. So you really need to decide on analytical strategies that are fit for purpose given those constraints. And I think that here you have to sort of decide what are the kind of data that I can get that are reasonably available to me to answer this evaluation question within the time frame and the budget I've got. Um, so for that reason, you might place emphasis on qualitative data or quantitative data, or maybe a mix of both. Uh, and depending on those different sort of uh, preconditions, different analytical techniques might be lend themselves more readily to what you want to do. Um, so with that sort of a long introduction, or I think that there are some analytical techniques that do hold a lot of promise to lend themselves to retroduction, which is really sort of the front and center of realist reasoning, if you want. And I think that we've seen some very interesting examples of qualitative comparative analysis coming out when you've got multiple cases, when you've got mixed methods data coming in. Here, I think that might be a very interesting technique to use in those cases. If you have a case where you relied mostly on a single case study, you have qualitative data. I think that there's some new work coming out on linked coding approach, which is very interesting. It might also be used for cross case analysis. And then if you have primarily quantitative data, I think we've seen some very good examples of using structural equation modeling for causal pathway analysis and mediator and moderator analysis that can also be used to shed light on CMO configurations. So I think that it depends on the situation, but there are some really promising techniques out there. Um,
Stefan, you've answered like a true realist with an "it depends," and and you're absolutely right, because every project and every decision that you make has to be justified and has to be fit for purpose, certainly within a, doing a realist evaluation or synthesis within a realist philosophy of science and being aligned in that ontology, epistemology, methodology, methods. So I really
yeah.
liked how that is true, and then so many different options that you mentioned, which is very exciting. I
Mm.
feel by having this toolkit of opportunity.
Yeah, sorry, I actually forgot one. I'm so sorry. In sort of my haste here, process tracing. I think there are some really fascinating examples coming out also right now with process tracing, combining realist evaluation and process tracing, sort of with for single case studies. So there's a bunch out there, and they can be combined in different ways also. So it's quite fascinating. I think that really what you need to think about is just think about what's called methodological congruence, um, and methodological convergence. And basically, methodological congruence is about aligning the program theory you want to test, that data situation, with the research design and the analytical techniques that you use. And of course, when you decide to work within the framework of realist evaluation, you should consider, well, here we are working with the generative and configurational causation at the front and center of what we do. So the methods you choose and the analytical techniques you choose should sort of convert or be congruent with that. And then you need to think about, how can I converge different kind of data, different kind of methods, so I can create a strong narrative, a strong explanatory account of why you postulate that in the context of a given intervention, these CMO configurations were triggered and these outcomes were created, and eventually what worked for whom, under what conditions or not.
Fantastic, and I love that mention of the alignment, from the very start and from the assumptions that you're making around the world to then your analytical strategy, and how all these decisions shape then the strategies that we may decide to choose. And with all this promise, Stefan, all this
Mhm,
promise and all these different options and all these different exciting elements that are
mhm,
coming over, one of the things that you highlighted that I found you know, quite intriguing was that many studies didn't report their analytical techniques. So either,
mhm,
there's a description in the data in the method section, maybe in the analysis a little bit, but
mhm,
not specifically that process or that decision making, or at least in any detail. So from your perspective, what's
mhm,
driving this lack of transparency, and what can we do to address it? Because if it's such an important element of, as you say, how we interpret data and we collect it, and how we
mhm,
then make we refine, refute, or confirm those CMOs, or those context mechanism outcome configurations. What should we do about this, and what
mhm.
are some of the reasons that could be happening?
Yeah, I think this is really crucial. I mean, because if you are looking towards a positivist position, it is really the design which gives you the credibility and an account of rigor. You know, you say you create a randomized controlled trial, and this design will make sure that it actually takes into account variation in context and so on and so forth. And if you adhere to standards for well conducted randomized controlled trials, you have rigor. Um, and this goes against some of the basic propositions of realist evaluation. Rigor here is basically about rigor in thinking. It is about thinking hard and long about how is it that I infer uh, causation through combining different kinds of data, different kinds of methods, and different kind of analytical techniques to create this probable account of causation. And there's certain basic things that need to be done here. And across gleaning across these different reviews we did, we found that in about half of these studies, there were no definitions of key constructs, such as the mechanism. No definition, or half didn't have a definition of context. Outcome seems to be easier. And also, we found that in about half of the studies, they didn't report on what analytical techniques and strategies were used. And to boot, then by far the majority of the studies that did report on their analytical techniques said they used thematic analysis. And when you see some of those that reported on using thematic analysis, they actually applied an experimental design. And to me, that is not methodologically congruent at all. I think there are some other explanations to that, but here you have to think rigorously about how to create that alignment from the question you want an answer to the data situation you got, how to collect or produce, if you want, those data, and how to analyze them. And if you haven't been thinking that through early on, then you are just going to wind up in a situation where you're trying to make the best out of a terrible situation. And this is where some analytical techniques lend themselves better to the realist endeavor than others.
Mm. I think what you mentioned there is so important, which is the failing to prepare is preparing to fail.
Mhm.
So without that initial preparation, thought process, and decisions that are justified along the way, and of course, in a realist project, there's an iterative nature, so you also have to prepare for some of the changes that may adapt. But having it really
Mhm.
clear at the start, that makes such a difference. And with all these options that you mentioned, Stefan, one thing that just came to my head now is that there'll be evaluators, researchers, students are thinking of combining some of this analytical techniques and strategies in their projects. But what do you feel are some of the biggest risks of this combinations, if any? Because you want to make sure that you're taking the value and the benefit of those analytical strategies, but at the same time without diluting potentially some of the areas and still remain in an analytical alignment with
Mhm.
everything else that we mentioned before. So do you see any risks involved and how can they be mitigated?
Well, I mean, obviously, as you're saying that once reality hits, the best of plans can be torn into pieces. But again, planning to or failing to plan is planning to fail. So I think that you need to consider this uh, and think very hard about your analytical strategy and put that into a methodology note or protocol or something. And say, this is what I intend to do. And then once reality hits and you can't get all the kinds of data that you want, or let's say that you were expecting to place a lot of emphasis on the data from a questionnaire among a recipient population. But it turns out that the response rate is abysmal. The quality of the answers in the questionnaire are dodgy and so on. So now you're in a situation where you have to regroup somehow. And this is where thinking about data triangulation or source triangulation and so on comes in. So you have to regroup. So I think in that sense, having a good plan A and perhaps a plan B is important. And I think that quite often you see some very interesting combinations of different techniques that are being combined in novel ways, and in that way also expanding sort of what can be done within realist evaluation. I saw a study not too long ago where Valerie Patin and some of her colleagues combined process evaluation and qualitative comparative analysis in one study, which was brilliant. I loved it. So I think that you should also by basically having a both a plan B and plan A, you can combine some of these things in novel ways. And but eventually, it's about answering those questions in the best possible way that are part of the evaluation endeavor.
Fantastic. That's so good, Stefan. Thank you so much. And I love as well that planning ahead, particularly in realist projects and that are so iterative, and also in evaluations that you're going to have so many decisions to make at every moment in time. I always had a conversation with my supervisor the other day, and I literally said to them, "Is like doing any project. 90% of it is project management, and
Mhm.
the rest is everything else in a way, right? So having very clear how you're going to manage the project and therefore your strategies is going to be useful." We've had it's great to hear from you, Stefan, about a topic that is so important for so many people in any kind of work that you're doing. And to wrap up some of these ideas that we've mentioned, I'd love to hear some of your top three tips for anyone who's listening right now around analytical strategies for realist evaluation or for realist work, realist research. They'll go back into their day-to-day lives, into their day-to-day jobs or work that they have to do, and they're making these decisions with themselves. They're trying to decide which one's the best to use for their
Mm.
project. So, what will be your top three tips for this exact question for my realist day analytical strategy situation? And I know it's hard to pick three, but
It is hard, yeah. But I would say the one most important is to force yourself to think about the analytical strategy as early on as possible. Uh, and with that, basically, a good adage would be to say, I'm not going to ask one single question without having a plan on how to analyze the data from that and where it goes into my report. Then I would say it's about once you do that, you have to ensure that you have the methodological congruence and convergence that I was talking about as a second. And then thirdly, I think that you need to consider how to choose a manageable number of DMO configurations. Um, Again, in this study, we saw a huge variation. I think one study had up to 23 CMO configurations in it, and another one had one, and the average was about four. Um, so, what's a good number? I can't tell you. It depends on the intervention that you're studying, the program theory, how complex it is, and so on, of course. But again, evaluation is done under constraint. So you have to sort of look at that and say, what can I actually manage given those constraints? The time, the budget. What are the most important CMOCs that I have to look at, and then focus on those, and of course, reason why are those the most salient, and why is it that I pay particular attention to those?
think early on. Congruence, feasibility, and manageable number. Fantastic. And that's really good 3 points to wrap up our conversation and for people to start thinking around their data analytical strategies in realist evaluation and synthesis. Stefan, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed hearing about you and everything that you have to bring here. And I'm looking forward to seeing hopefully some more of your work with Sebastian and the team because I know that it's hard to find it, but please keep it going because it's fantastic. And for everyone else listening, thank you so much for another episode of The Realist Lens. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Stefan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.